Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Good morning, you guys. Good morning. All right, just checking the sound. I thought I was doing something by turning the camera around before I started the live, but of course it was facing the wrong direction. So, how are you guys this morning? Please stay tuned because maybe I'll make the announcement twice. Okay, welcome to my channel, or maybe more than twice. I've seen people do these things more than twice. It's really early this morning. I got up early and I got done early, and I wanted to come on here and do this live early. And so it's a little earlier today than what I usually do. But hopefully people will still be able to come on here and join me. My name is Natasha. Welcome to my channel. I do these lives just to come after I've had my time with the Lord, or one of my times with the Lord. This doesn't have to be the only time you have with the Lord. The Lord is with you all the time. You know, my initial time with the Lord, I like to come on here and process with you guys. I'm just a regular person. I'm not a Bible teacher or anything like that. I'm just a regular person who welcomed the Holy Spirit into my life, you know, whose job it is to teach me all things. And I crack the Bible open and I read it for myself, and Holy Spirit is interactive in this process, and it's been wonderful. I've been getting to know the Lord. Okay, and so I come on here and do these lives just to encourage you guys to do the same. He doesn't have me in a special place that he doesn't have anybody else. And so if you take the time, he will speak to you and direct you as well. So I just really want to encourage you to crack your Bible open. And so a few weeks, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, I came on here and told you guys that I was considering doing a Zoom Bible study in real time with you guys. Obviously, if it's Zoom, it's in real time. I had viewers inquire and ask, and so the answer is yes. And so I want to do a Bible study with you guys, and so I asked you guys to email me if you're interested and let me know what times work best for you. And so I have tallied those responses, and I've come up with a time for the Zoom Bible study, you guys. So for now, I'm keeping it open. We have enough people in order to be able to have, a comfortable Bible study, but we have room for more. I think I will probably cap it, but for now, I want to keep it open. I'm going to announce the time, okay? This is the time that we're going to be doing the Bible studies. They're going to be once a week, okay? And the time that I came up with is every Wednesday at from 6 to 7 a.m. It's really interesting. I was thinking that maybe we would end up with an afternoon time, but obviously you guys are watching me early in the morning, so early morning seemed to be a good time for people. And so for me, I'm choosing Wednesday from 6 to 7 a.m. So if you want to do this Bible study, that's what time we're going to be doing it. Now, if you didn't send me your information, I don't have your email address, so I can't send you the Zoom link. So if you are interested in joining us, please email me at cherisheddaughterat no, that's my new name is Cherished Daughter. My email is still the same as before. It's cherishmydaughter@gmail.com. If you email me at cherishmydaughter@gmail.com and put Zoom Bible Study in the subject, I will add you to the mailing link so that you can get the Zoom link for us to be able to do this. Okay? And so, but I need your email address. I can't put that in the description box. Okay? And so let's take care of that. And I look forward to seeing you. The way we're going to do these Bible studies is we're going to pick a book of the Bible to study. And we're going to go through it line by line in a, discussion type of fashion where we'll hear from each and every person, with regards to what the Lord is telling us about that scripture at that time. I mean, that might be different from the kind of Bible studies some of you may have attended in the past. It's not going to be a Bible study where I come with a teaching and you're just sitting there and you're just following along. It's going to be interactive. And I've done Bible studies like this. I'm in one for couples, and this is how my husband and I study the Bible with our kids. It's been wonderful. Holy Spirit really does show up. And I think what's wonderful about it is if you're struggling reading the Bible on your own, it's almost like we're doing it together, which will help you to be able to do it on your own. And so that's what my vision is for this Bible study. So, other than that, let's just move forward with our teaching. And I guess I'll announce this again toward the end of this live for the people that come later on. But how did we get here? How did we get here? You guys, it's been a while since I've done a live, and I've continued to move forward every day with my reading plan. I'm doing Bible in chronological order. I use the U Bible. I use the As It Happens. It's an app on my phone. I use the As It Happens reading plan, which is the Bible in chronological order. And the last time we did a live, I think we were talking about the end of Solomon's reign, the end of Solomon's life, and how he ends up dying, and his son Rehoboam becomes king. That's where we left off. Okay, but I've continued to move forward, and now at this point, I'm up to King Ahab, and I'm going to read what I read today that motivated me to come on here and do this live. Okay, so we're turning to 1 Chronicles chapter 16. I have 1 Chronicles written here, but I have my Bible turned to 2 Chronicles. Yeah, it must be. I'm going to put 1 Chronicles chapter 16. That's not right. Hold on a minute. I must have just written down. No, it's not 1 Chronicles. 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 16. I think it must be. Let's go there. Because a lot of Chronicles tells this parallel story. Yeah. A lot of Chronicles tell the parallel story of what's going on in Kings, and some details are in one aspect of the telling and other details are in another, so it's kind of nice to read them side by side. And so that's why the Bible in chronological order has me reading them side by side like this. But 1 Chronicles chapter 16 verse 29 through 34. How did we get here? This is talking about the kingdom of Israel. Okay? Now we're dealing with, I'm going to go back after I read this passage and fill you in. But at this point, Israel has now been split into two kingdoms. I think that's where we left off last time. You have the kingdom of Israel to the north, which consists of the 11 tribes of Israel. 11 of the tribes of Israel. And then the kingdom of Judah to the south, which is that one main tribe, Judah, okay? That's to the south. And it includes, a couple of remnants of other smaller tribes, but we'll get into that, okay? And so now we're dealing with two kingdoms, and we're watching how their kingdoms unfold side by side, okay? So right now, I'm talking about the kingdom of Israel, the one with the majority of Israel, with the 11 tribes to the north, okay? Ahab is now their king. Let's hear what this says. Verse 29 through 34. It says, in the 30th year of Asa, king of Judah. So after Asa had been reigning for 38 years, Ahab, the son of Omri, became king over Israel. Okay? And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. Verse 30. Now Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. And it came to pass, as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in all the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took a wife, Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. Then he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab made a wooden image. Ahab did more to provoke the God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. In his days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation with Abiram his firstborn, meaning on the dead body and the dead bones of his son, as in a sacrifice to lay the foundations of a city. This is being done by Israel, okay? And with his youngest son, Segub, he set up its gates. So he killed another son and buried that son and set up its gates. Now, if you study ancient civilizations and ancient cultures, this type of child sacrifice, it's meant to bring a certain, it's like paying a ransom or giving an offering or some kind, in order to invoke the favor of some kind of deity. Okay? Clearly not God, who is against human sacrifice. Okay? This is what Israel is doing now. Okay? So it says, and with his youngest son, Segub, he set up its gates according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through Joshua, the son of Nun. So if you go way back, there's a whole prophecy that this was going to happen. Okay? This is how far Israel has gotten from God. How did that happen? What in the world happened? How did they get this far? Okay? How are there two kingdoms now? And how is the kingdom of Israel, which is the majority of the tribes, the majority of the children of Israel, the children of Jacob? Israel is the name that God gave Jacob. So when it's talking about the children of Israel, it's not just talking about the children of a nation. It's talking about the children of Jacob, Jacob's children. Okay? So throughout the whole Old Testament, God is referring to Jacob's kids. This is what happened to Jacob's kids. His name's Israel now. This is what's going on with Jacob's kids. I had a relationship with Jacob, and Jacob is now with me. And now I'm looking out to see what his kids are doing, what his descendants are doing. Okay? And this is what's going on with Jacob's kids. Okay? What in the world happened? We came out of Solomon's reign. where Solomon was the wealthiest man that ever lived, and he was the wisest man that ever lived. Okay, he had a lot of riches. I don't know if it quite says he was the wealthiest man that ever lived, but it does say that he was the wisest man that ever lived. And the wealth that is described in his day is mind-boggling. Gold is like stones. That's how wealthy he was. Okay? But what in the world happened? During that time, Solomon had his issues. He was off. But he still only, encouraged people to serve the Most High God. Like, what in the world happened? Okay? And that's it right there, what slipped out of my mouth. I mean, he had his issues. I mean, he generally knew God, and this was the way that we needed to go. But, he made a few compromises. I mean, I know it says in the law of Moses that a king should not multiply wives for himself, multiply horses and chariots for himself. I know it talks about how they shouldn't intermarry, with the foreign nations, not because God doesn't love foreigners and that he has prejudice against them, but he's implemented a certain way of life for them. And these other nations don't live this way. And so what God made clear to them is, you're not going to take a wife and take husbands from these other nations and change them and make them live the way I'm trying to get you to live. Instead, you're going to want to live the way they live. They're going to cause you to live the way they live, and you're going to forget about me, and you're going to start worshiping their idols, their gods who aren't alive at all. Okay? And in some places it even refers to them as, some of these idols that they're worshiping, they're actually worshiping demons. Okay? And so God said, that's what's gonna happen to you if you do that. So Solomon started off well. I mean, he built the temple. It was glorious. It was amazing. He put a lot of his wealth, his resources into that. He set up the worship exactly the same way. The system for sacrifice and worship exactly in the way that God had given it to David for him to do. He followed everything to the T. And he made sure that was up and running and would not be interrupted. But he had this thing for women. He had this thing for foreign women. And he's a king. He has to make those political alliances. You know what I'm saying? He needs to make certain, wise marriages to solidify some political alliances and whatnot. So he had an excess of about, I think they said about 700 wives and 400 concubines or 600. I mean, it was well over 1,000 women at his disposal. And a lot of them were foreigners. And it says that for a while he was able to do this juggling and this balancing act. But when you read the book of Ecclesiastes, that really gets into his mind, really gets into his worldview, really gets into the way he sees things. You see that he never doubts that God is real and that God exists. But he kind of wrestles with how involved God really is in our day-to-day affair, and how intimate our relationship can really be with God. And, to a certain extent, there's not much of a relationship described. Okay? And he concludes with, at the very least, we need to obey God. The only good and the only thing good and purposeful that can come out of our existence is to at least obey God and to follow his laws. But we see that he doesn't have the same kind of intimacy with God that David had. David, talking about his heart is longing for God, is panting after God, calling him my God, and I'm going to get up early and search for you, and you're my defense and you're my shelter, and I'm going to hide in you. And I'm, the level of intimacy we read in the Psalms that David has with God is very different from, the almost cerebral experience that we read about in Ecclesiastes and in Proverbs. It's like wisdom to know that God is and to know that he should be feared, but there's no relationship there, at least not in the same way that we see with David. And so what ends up happening is he has all these foreign wives, and it seems like he plods along and he does this dance of compromise. Because if you're gonna bring these foreigners in, you know, he wants them to be happy. He wants it to be, you know, a positive relationship to enforce, you know, these alliances that he's trying to make. And also maybe he just liked these women too, some of these women too. I don't know that every foreign marriage he made was a political alliance, okay? I'm just speculating from what I've read in the text. But, you know, to a certain extent, you want them to be happy. All of them are not converting to Judaism. Some of them, in order for them to be happy, they need to be able to live the way they live back home. And, you know, he provided for them lavishly in every other way. And so he built temples for them. Oh, you serve this God this way? Okay, here's your temple. Here's your temple. Here's your temple. And before you know it, you've got these temples in Israel now for these foreign wives who are having children, who are, you know, populating Israel. You know what I'm saying? And maybe at first Solomon still went to the temple and did his due diligence before God, and it was just his wives going to the temple. But you know how it is between a husband and a wife. Babe, why don't you go with me today? You don't have to do it. I just want to be with you. You know what I'm saying? And little by little, slowly over time, it says in his old age, Solomon's wives turned his heart away from God, and his heart was no longer loyal only to God. Okay? So this is interesting. It's not God, I cut you off. It's God, I'm doing my due diligence and I'm doing all this other stuff. Okay? And sometimes it seems kind of harmless because after all, I didn't cut God off. I mean, I still worship on Sundays. I'm just doing all this other stuff that, you know, is not conducive, that God maybe told me not to do. Okay? And so we see that the example that the generation before gives, it 100% affects the generation after it. Okay? It 100% affects it. Okay? So after Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam takes the throne, and he doesn't have the same scruples that his father has. You know, he was 41 years old when he took the throne, but in that culture, he was still considered somewhat of a young man. And I think we talked about it last time, about how when he took the throne, you know, right before Solomon died, God, well, I don't know if it was right before, but before Solomon died, God let him know how unhappy he was with how his heart was no longer loyal toward him. And God let him know that there was going to be a consequence for that God was going to pull most of the kingdom away from him. Okay? But for the sake of David and David's loyalty to him. Okay? Because we always talk about generational curses in the sense that, you know, if somebody's wicked, God will curse to the third or fifth, I can't remember which level generation, but the sins of the father or end up being visited upon the children. That aspect is well known. But in the same breath, it also says that for obeying God and walking with God, God will bless the coming generations after so much more because of that. And we see that with Solomon, that even though God was within his rights to say, you blew it, I even gave you wisdom, so you have no excuse. You know what I'm saying? I'm taking it all from you. But he said, but because David was so faithful, and because I made David a promise, okay, and because David pleased me so much, I'm letting Jesus come through David's line. I'm reserving a remnant because of David. God said, you've lost the kingdom because of this foolishness, but I'm only taking away 11 tribes from you. I'm gonna leave you one tribe because of David, you know. And that's how the kingdom of Judah comes up. But the way it happens, the way it unfolds, is that Solomon dies with all 12 kingdoms. He's still king over all 12 kingdoms, and he's gloriously buried because God says, this ain't going to happen in your lifetime. It's going to happen in your son's lifetime. And it's because his son was assessed to not be worthy. Okay? His son demonstrated weaknesses and flaws and a lack of loyalty to God. So in his son's time, it comes to pass. And the way it comes to pass is, Solomon dies, and there had been a prophecy where God had said, not only am I taking the 11 kingdoms away from you and I'm just leaving you the one kingdom, I'm going to give the other 11 kingdoms to your servant, Jeroboam. And he was some kind of official in charge of, he was in charge of was he in charge of the house? I can't remember what he was in charge of, but he was in charge of, a significant aspect of Solomon's administration. I'm going to give it to your servant Jeroboam. And at that time, Jeroboam was described as a mighty man of valor. Okay? And so Solomon reacted much like Saul in that he wanted to kill Jeroboam when he found that out. So Jeroboam ends up fleeing to Egypt, okay, and is protected by the Pharaoh Shishak, okay? And so that's all well and good. So after Solomon dies, Jeroboam comes back out of, hiding. And Jeroboam comes back. Solomon's son Rehoboam is made king of Judah, okay? And so we see the orderly, way of, succession, that after a king dies, his son becomes the king. Okay, that's the natural order of things. And we see that happening in Judah. Okay? And so the people come to their new king, Rehoboam. The 11 tribes, they come to Rehoboam. They all come to Rehoboam. And they say, the 12 tribes. And they tell him, your father, with all the building projects and all the stuff he did, he required a lot out of us. It was a heavy yoke, lots of heavy taxes. We had to give him a lot. Now that you're going to be king, we want to know, are you going to lighten the load? We're asking you to lighten the load. Okay? And so Rehoboam goes to his father's advisors and he tells them, yeah, come back in 3 days. I'll let you know what my response to that is. And he goes to his father's advisors. His father was the wisest man that ever lived. So his advisors must be good. Okay, they can't be dumb. So he goes to his father's advisors and says, this is what the people want. What should I do? How should I respond to that? And the advisors say, yeah, you should. Have a, let these people know that you will lighten the load, that you're going to serve them as a good king. And if you do that, they'll love you forever. So that's what he tells them. He tells Rehoboam to tell the people. That doesn't sound good to Rehoboam. That's not what he wants to hear. He wants to be a great king, even greater than his father. You know what I'm saying? He's like that son who wants to outdo his father. He's proud of his father. He knows his father was great. He wants to be even greater still. So that didn't really flatter his pride and his ego. And so he rejected that advice. And instead it says he went and asked the young men that grew up with him. So he was 41 when he took the throne. So we're not talking about some 20-year-old king. Okay, but in that culture, that was still considered kind of young. Okay, and so his friend said, nah, you gotta rule these, you gotta let them know who's boss. You gotta tell them you're gonna be even more severe than your father. And so he went and told them people that even his little finger is thicker than his father's waist. He's going, if his father corrected them with whips, he was going to correct them with scourges. And so the people were like, you're not like the 11 tribes of Israel, 11 other tribes, the ones he wasn't from. He's from Judah. The 11 other tribes were like, you are not for us. And this reminds me of an old hurt and an old sense of not being a part that I felt way back in the day when David became king. What part do we have with the sons of Jesse? We feel less than. We feel like he favors Judah anyway. And so I knew you weren't going to be for us. And so they basically defect. They defect and they crown Jeroboam as king over Israel, which is in fulfillment of prophecy that God has said, I'm giving the kingdom to Jeroboam. And they knew of the prophecy and they submitted to that. So Jeroboam becomes king, a servant. He has no royal blood or anything. He was just Solomon's servant. He becomes king over Israel. but God is with him because he's considered a mighty man of valor at that time. Okay? And then Rehoboam and his foolish self is left with the tribe of Judah. Okay? And initially, he thinks it's all talk. They all go back to their own homes. And he thinks that it's all talk. And he sends his the usual dude to collect taxes as in the past or whatever. And they kill him. And that's when he realized, oh no, this thing is for real. Okay? And so he tries to muster up an army to go up against Israel to get the 11 tribes back. But God sends a prophet and stops him and says, no, there's not going to be no civil war. You're not getting the 11 tribes back. I'm the one that did this thing. So stop. And so he's not allowed to fight and get the other kingdoms back. So he decides to settle down and just rule over Judah and be satisfied with that. And I think Ephraim at this time has kind of been absorbed into Judah and such. Okay? And so now we have these two kingdoms. And now Rehoboam's pride has to calm down some. But now Jeroboam is king of Israel. Now, the thing that ends up happening to Jeroboam is now he's king of Israel. But now, he's living in another part of the of Israel. Don't forget the temple that Solomon had built, where they're supposed to come at certain times of the year and offer their sacrifices and worship and everything. All of that is in Israel. But Jeroboam is crowned king, and I think he's crowned king. He's in Shechem. Okay? He's all the way up in Shechem. So he begins to think about, let me just make sure that that's right. Yeah, he builds up Shechem as his capital city, and he's king in Shechem. Okay? And so what he really should have thought was, okay, well, God is the one that gave me this kingdom. Okay? I'm going to allow him to establish me. After all, I have the 11 tribes. Rehoboam has 1 tribe. He's no threat to me. Let me set about serving God and building up my kingdom, and we will prosper and thrive, because this is what I've watched him do. I saw him do it with Solomon, and I saw him do it with David. Let's go with God. But instead, it says in his heart, Jeroboam started to think about the situation, and a fear rose up in him. And the fear that rose up in him was, wait a minute, if we keep trying to serve God according to the law of Moses and according to what God told Moses that we're supposed to do, that means every time the people have to go offer a sacrifice and do those major feasts, they have to go all the way to Jerusalem and see that nice city where Rehoboam is reigning, as compared to this new city that I'm trying to build up. And then they have to go into that golden temple, that gorgeous temple made of limestone on the outside so that it shines like the sun. Okay? That's where they're going to have to go every time they have to offer a sacrifice. If they have to do that on a regular basis, won't that be a threat to me? Won't they start comparing what Rehoboam has with what I've been able to do here? And won't they want to go back? Won't that be a threat to my kingdom? He goes, nah, that's too much of a risk. We need to fix this situation. And so dude comes up with the plan. I'm not abandoning God. We still need to serve God. But what I need to do is I need to set up a worship situation right here so that the people can stay right here and worship God and don't have to go into Jerusalem and be tempted by what they see there. And then my kingdom will be established, and then my kingdom will be assured. Okay? But the thing is, I don't think I'm going to be able to get the Levites to go along with this. I'm not going to be able to take them and make them want to do this new thing that I'm trying to do, even though we're still serving God. But they might feel like they have to follow the law of Moses, and the law of Moses doesn't leave room for me to set up a worship situation right here. According to what Moses said, they're going to have to go where the ark is and whatnot, and the brazen altar and all that stuff. And so I'm going to have to make something completely new. And so that's exactly what he did. Okay? He basically broke every rule, every situation that God had set up. The first thing he did was he molded 2 calves. Remember the calves in the wilderness that they made when Moses went up to get the 10 commandments, and it took too long for him to come down, and they wondered if he was dead, and they made Aaron make a calf, and they thought they would worship that as God. I mean, as a representation of God, and God didn't like it then, and God didn't like it now with Jeroboam. Okay? So Jeroboam ends up making these 2 calves. He sets one up in Shechem and one up in Dan, and then he tells the people, worship here. So you don't have to make that whole long trek to Jerusalem. Isn't that more convenient? This is the same God. This is the same God that brought us out of Egypt. But we're just going to set it up here for us to worship him. I mean, what does it matter? We're worshiping the same God. What do the details matter if the end goal is to worship God? As long as we're still worshiping the same God, surely it's still all good. What does it matter what we call it? What does it matter if it's actually, a building with specific measurements given by God, put in a specific place where God said it should be? What does all of that matter? Isn't the end goal just to be able to offer sacrifices at the appointed time? Isn't that what God is after anyway? So as long as we do that, we're okay. Okay? So first he set up the calves, and then he had to set up the sacrificial situation, and he couldn't use the priests from Levi, so he came up with his own priesthood. What better kind of priesthood would there be except taking men from every different kind of people group that's in the kingdom? You don't have to be from a special tribe or anything like what God said. God said all the priests had to come from the tribe of Levi. He identified Levi as his firstborn, representative of the firstborn that he spared in Egypt, and all the priests had to come out of Levi. Okay? But now he's saying, well, yeah, that was all well and good, that what God came up with, but isn't this better? I mean, we're not all from Levi. You'll have a representative that's just like you as a priest. And then it developed so that anyone who wanted to be a priest could be a priest. There weren't any real limitations. There wasn't any kind of real consecration or being set apart or any kind of true righteous process that you had to go through to become a priest. Okay? And so those were the priests that he instituted, and he built these altars in high places, okay, and so that the sacrifice to God could continue, okay, and he himself led the way in offering sacrifices, which was another big no-no, because in the Bible God says, I want a separation. Your king is not going to be, the only king that will ever be both high priest and king is Jesus. Okay? But, and we had an example of a king who thought he was going to offer sacrifices, even though God said you wasn't supposed to do that, and he was struck with leprosy. God was like, no, I don't want that. Okay? But Jeroboam, as king of Israel, he led the way with offering sacrifices. Okay? And so he set it all up. And it would have been bad enough if he set it all up for just himself to do his own thing and worship God his own way. But what was messed up about it even more is the fact that he's king. And he did this kind of state-sponsored religion type thing where he caused the people of Israel to sin. Now, everybody didn't capitulate to this. Everybody didn't say that this was okay. As is always the case, when Satan rises up in tyranny, over government and tries to make everybody obey, everybody usually doesn't obey. There's always a remnant. There's always people that can see the deception and the lie, and they will resist and refuse to obey. Okay, they know it's not God. And whether they have to give up their jobs, their homes, their lives, whatever, they will do what it takes not to capitulate. Just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that we're going to read about down the line. O King, live forever, ever. We don't care what you do to us. We're not bowing down. Okay, so it says that the Levites left their common lands, they left their homes, they left everything that they had in the kingdom of Israel because there was no more room for them, because this was their life. This was the service that they were given to, everything that pertained to the temple. And now in this new situation, they're telling them, we don't need you. We're using our own priests so that we can do our own thing. Okay? And so they escaped in droves to Judah. Okay? And if you remember how God had set things up when he split up the promised land, he had sprinkled the Levites all over the land of Israel so that they would be there to teach the people and show the people, so that the people would know the word, that they would know the law, that they would know what God's expectations were. But because of this, it was like God's word and God's law and God's truth was being removed from the kingdom of Israel. So the Levites all sided with Rehoboam, and it says when the godly element went to Rehoboam, it said it strengthened the kingdom of Judah. So now the kingdom of Judah has only that one tribe with Ephraim and now Levi, but because God is there, it's strengthened. Okay, and so they end up leaving, and it says there were other people from like the tribe of Simeon, and and it names a bunch of different tribes where people were like, we don't want to worship God this new way. We got to worship God the way he said for himself to be worshiped, because that's what worship is. Worship is not a gift that you're offering God in and of yourself. Worship is your obedience to do what God has asked you to do, to love and serve him the way he needs to be loved and served according to who he is. You know what I'm saying? That's what true worship is. So the thing that Jeroboam is setting up is not worship. It's actually rebellion. Okay? It's actually rebellion. It's actually anti-worship. It's actually the spirit of Antichrist that's actually in the world right now. You know what I'm saying? And so now we have a situation where the majority of the tribes are in the kingdom of Israel, but God has left the room. Okay? And you've got this new religion where, this new system that's imitating the truth. That's claiming to be the truth. But in actuality, it's a lie. Okay? And this right here is what begins to affect Israel, so that they end up deteriorating to the place that they're at. Okay, when I read you the passage that I read you at the beginning of this live in 1 Kings chapter 16. Okay, because order, righteousness, justice, peace, these are all characteristics of God. And when you remove God from the equation, these things start to fall apart. Okay, and what we begin to see, and it's not that God stayed silent as this happened. Okay, because on the day that Jeroboam was ready to dedicate his temple and he was set to offer sacrifices, God sent a prophet to speak to him and say, this is not it, dude. This is not what I want. Okay, I reject this. And one day, this very altar that you're using to do what I don't want you to do, okay, there's going to come a king, and this happens many years down the line. There's going to come a king, Josiah, that's going to rise up, and he's going to destroy this altar, and he's going to, all these new priests that you're coming up with that you think are good, their bones are going to be sacrificed on this altar. You know what I'm saying? And all this stuff is going to be destroyed. Okay? God lets him know, I reject this. And the whole way the whole thing unfolds, and he tries to have the prophet arrested, and he points his hand to do it, and it says his hand shrivels up, and then he cries out to God, oh, have mercy, and then God, the prophet prays, and his hand is healed, which is a message from God. Repent now. Turn away from this. You don't have to go down this path. After all, I did choose you to give the 11 kings to. Serve me properly. Don't worry about the people going down to Israel. And your kingdom will be established. But he refused to listen. Even though he was healed, he was like, oh, thank you. He wanted to wine and dine the prophet in thanksgiving. Instead of, realizing that God is dealing with me here. And I have an opportunity to stop this disaster that's going to end in nothing but death and destruction for my people. They're going to lose the promised land. They're going to end up having to become foreigners in other lands where they're going to be severely mistreated and killed and murdered and abused. You know what I'm saying? We could stop this right now. But his principal mistake was, I just need to pacify God. As long as he gets his sacrifices, it doesn't matter what we call it. It doesn't matter how we do it. It doesn't matter where it happens. It doesn't matter who's leading it. They don't have to have a certain kind of lifestyle. They don't have to have any kind of limitations or restrictions. Isn't the end goal to offer a sacrifice? As long as the sacrifice goes up, God will be okay with it, right? As long as we still worship God, what difference does it make if we make room for these other gods and these other things? Isn't it okay for them to just live out their truth, their own experience, their own expression of worship to their God? Why does that have to corrupt me? Okay. But we see that it does. Because it says Jeroboam reigns. I think he reigns for something like 40 years or whatever. And then we watch what unfolds. Okay. The kingdom of Judah doesn't end up having this glorious, perfect walk with God, consistently from beginning to end until they end up going into captivity. But there's a clear contrast between what happens in Israel and what happens in Judah, and how quickly Israel declines as compared to how Judah declines, because they have a series of righteous kings that keep bringing them back to God, and they keep calling out to God, and they still have, a loyalty and a tie to God. And we just see how everything just deteriorates for Israel. Okay, after Jeroboam died, he wasn't of true royal blood, and so he's some kind of conspiracy. He ends up getting killed, and then his son takes the throne. There's conspiracy left and right. Whoever can kill the king can become king. There's no respect for the sanctity of royal life. There's no at first, the king's son doesn't become king. Anybody can become king. There are all kinds of wars that go on. And there's Asa rises up as king, and he reigns for like 40 years or something like that. And during his reign, a whole bunch of kings rise up and fall, rise up and fall, rise up and fall, rise up and fall in the kingdom of Israel. And there's always fighting. There's always bickering between Israel and Judah, between Israel and Judah. And what does that look like to the outside world? Okay. When I was teaching world history, we always talked about how, when there's infighting in a nation, it creates a vacuum. And it's almost like it draws the attention of other stronger nations to come in and fill that space. Y'all are both weak because you're fighting each other. So that when somebody on the outside, they can easily come in and dominate and take you over. Okay. So with that little bit of compromise, over time, it gets to the point, well, Well, we didn't value what God told us to do, which ended up meaning that we didn't really value God because he told us what he told us to do because of who he is. And we thought we could make him coexist with other gods. And then ultimately it got to the point where we were like, well, since God has not that much value anyway, and is not necessarily superior to all these other gods, why bother with him at all? Let's just abandon him. Okay? And so we come to Ahab, okay, where we had all the kings before him who were who had the weird mixed religion that Jeroboam came up with. It says they all the kings after him were described, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he walked after the ways of Jeroboam, meaning that he continued that state sponsored religion. Okay, and then we get to Ahab, and now he's worshiping Baal outright. Forget God. It's Baal now. Baal is stronger. Baal, the god of the Sidonians. My wife is a Sidonian. We just gonna go with that. Okay? And so it's a slow fade. It's a slow fade. And I think an important guardrail to have in place is to watch those compromises. There's no room for compromise. And it might seem like a little thing, but it's not small. It's not small. And be aware of the next generation that's watching you. Okay? You might be making a compromise. You might know it's wrong. You might know that it's not what you should be doing. You might know that God is really the true God that you need to be serving. You might not be able to really communicate that to your kid. And the only thing your kid sees is your compromise. And your kid might come to the conclusion that God is no greater than these idols that you have put right next to him, and choose the idol instead. And that's what's tragic, from generation to generation to generation to generation to generation to generation. Don't go there. And so it's really been interesting, you guys, for me to go through the kings this time, because in the past, when I've studied the kings, it's been a really depressing process for me, and thinking, wow, look at how low they sunk, and I understand some of the weaknesses that they have, who can stand, who can succeed, you know what I'm saying? Even the kingdom of Judah ends up heading south ultimately. You know what I'm saying? They don't end up in a good place. They also end up being led into captivity eventually. And so I remember in the past feeling so discouraged and thinking nobody can succeed. And not really wanting to read the Kings, not really wanting to see how low that they had sunk. But I feel like for the first time this year, I'm really, really honing in on the side-by-side comparison. And over and over and over, it's like God's doing an abject lesson. Okay? Now the kingdom of Israel, remember, in Deuteronomy, before he brought them to the promised land, he made half of the people stand on one mountain and half of the people stand on the other mountain. And one of the mountains was the mountain of obedience and what happens when you obey. And the other mountain was the mountain of disobedience and what happens when you disobey. And watching the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, it's like God's doing this lesson where he's showing, look what happened. They're the same people, basically. They're the same bloodline. It's not that one group is better than the other. The difference between them is that one is choosing to follow me. This is how I lead. This is how I preserve. This is how I protect. Okay, and the other one is choosing to go with the idols, with the foreigners, with how you look around and the grass looks greener on the other side, and you think you're so you're so stifled by all the rules and limitations that are being put on you because of your service to God, and you're looking at other people thinking that they're having a much better time than you. But literally, when you look at the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah side by side, you see that the guardrails are for your good, for your protection, so that you will have a good, happy and peaceful life. It's like you follow God, you have peace. You follow God, your enemies have the fear of God on you. Asa, when you read about him, it says the fear of God was on his enemies, so that they didn't attack him. Excuse me, he didn't have to deal with war. Okay. Whereas when you look at the kingdom of Israel, they're fighting the Philistines. They're fighting this, they're fighting that. You know what I'm saying? Their enemies are coming all around them. And there's there's infighting. There's all this infighting and rebellion within, and treason and conspiracy and mutiny. There's no peace without God. There's no righteousness without God. There's no justice without God. And then God's judgment is coming against them, because the leadership is held responsible, because they're leading the rest of Israel to sin, and it's making their crime doubly bad. You're sinning, and as king, you're making the people sin too. And there's a famine of the word. There's no word in Samaria whatsoever. Leave the Levites have left. There's the word of God is not there, so that there is no truth. Okay. Looking at the kingdom of Israel is the perfect picture of what happens when everybody has a truth that they're living, and it's all a lie. So it's been really powerful, you guys. I have really, really, really been enjoying it, and I hope you'll join me. Wherever the Lord leads you to study the Word, even if it's not Bible in chronological order. But that's all I have for you guys this morning. That's all I have for you guys. So everything that I've shared, you can read about it in First and Second Kings and in Chronicles. Okay. Go ahead and do your research and do the backstory. But I want to talk about the Bible study again. So I've chosen a time for the Zoom Bible study that I'm having. We're going to be meeting on Wednesday mornings between 6 and 7 a.m. So I will send the first Zoom link this coming Wednesday. Okay, not today, obviously, next Wednesday. Let's see what the date is. Let me see. So today's the 25th. So our first Zoom Bible study, is it going to be February 2nd? Our first Zoom Bible study will be on February 2nd from 6 to 7 p.m. First Zoom Bible study, February 2nd from 6 to 7 a.m. So it's going to be an early morning Bible study, 6 to 7 a.m., which is very appropriate because I met you guys early in the morning. So we're going to be doing it every week. We're going to be studying the Bible. We're going to choose a book of the Bible. I'd like to start with Ephesians, but I want to poll the group to see if people would want to start with a different book. We're going to go through it line by line, allowing each person to share what the Lord is putting on their heart. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to stop at every line and go around the room. What's the Lord telling you this time? I do these studies myself. I'm part of a couples Bible study where we do this, and we study like this as a family. It's more like you're reading through the passage, and then something will stand out, and then somebody will have something to share about it, and then we'll hear and we'll discuss whatever they share. And you just keep going along like that until you're done. It's going to be for an hour from 6 to 7 every Wednesday. Okay, that's my goal. Okay, and so I'm keeping it open. I am going to cap it. I don't want it to be too big, but we do have room for a couple more people. So if you're interested, send me an email at cherishmydaughter@gmail.com so that I can send you the Zoom link for the live Bible study. So that's all I have for you guys this morning. I hope you have a blessed day. Don't get dizzy as I turn this around.